Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 122 of the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast. Joining me today, former Republican, author, columnist now at the New Republic, the great Bruce Bartlett, anti-racist speaker and author Tim Wise, and entrepreneur and advocate for a $25 minimum wage. That's right, Joe Sanberg joins me for the first time. I'm Pete Dominic. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hey guys, welcome to episode 122, coming at you from upstate New York, where I am visiting my parents in the house that I grew up in. Very excited to be here. It's bringing me a lot of happiness and a lot of peace and calmness, and I'm really happy just to be with my mom and dad. I was talking to a good friend of mine today whose dad is dealing with pretty severe Alzheimer's, and it was hard. It sounds really difficult to hear about that situation, and so it really gave me an awesome perspective as I'm here with my mom and dad. My dad, who recovered from a heart attack and losing vision in his right eye, back this fall to being out there back on his bike and mowing the lawn and having a lot of laughs and a lot of fun with my family. Really happy that my wife and my daughters are here with me, and I'm just in a very good place. I've been in some pretty dark places over the past 5 months, and many of you have been joining me since the pandemic started, but things are going, actually, ironically, pretty good for me and my close circle of family and friends, and I'm just trying to do my best to stay in the moment and appreciate the time that I have with my mom and my dad here at the house I grew up in. I'll post some videos and pictures online so you can see. It's just so beautiful right here on this dead-end street surrounded by farmers' fields, where when I was growing up, I thought it was so boring, and I wanted to get out of here, and now I'm so happy to be back. Okay, so I got 3 great guests joining me on today's podcast, and I'm very excited about the conversations that I had with all 3 of these guys. But before I get to them, I wanted to play for you something from Last Week Tonight on HBO, John Oliver, which airs Sunday night. He, in this soundbite, explained what defunding the police meant, at least according to him. I thought this was interesting and worth sharing with you here at the top of the show. Here's John Oliver on Last Week Tonight, HBO.
Defunding the police absolutely does not mean that we eliminate all cops and just succumb to the purge. Instead, it's about moving away from a narrow conception of public safety that relies on policing and punishment and investing in a community's actual safety net, things like stable housing, mental health services, and community organisations. The concept is that the role of the police can then significantly shrink because they are not responding to the homeless or to mental health calls or arresting children in schools or really any other situation where the best solution is not someone showing up with a gun. That is the idea behind defund the police if you actually listen to it.
So that phrase, defund the police, is one you're going to start to hear a lot more. I personally don't think it's the greatest messaging because, as John Oliver says, well, if you just listen to it, that's not how it works in politics and media. That's just not how messaging works. You hear these types of phrases: government takeover of healthcare, defund the police, reparations, and you don't think or know much about what they mean. And so I'm not sure it's the best messaging. He explains it well, and I think that would go a long way because police have to do the jobs of mental health advocates and experts and teachers and even parents and other members of the community, and they shouldn't have to. And so they shouldn't get the budget to have to. So apparently Joe Biden, by the way, opposes calls to defund the police, according to his campaign. We'll see how that plays out for his campaign. I also saw this today. For the first time ever, a majority of Americans believe black people are treated unfairly by police. That's according to a Rasmussen poll, which usually skews to conservative results. But really, the first time ever, a majority of Americans believe black people are treated unfairly by police? 2020? What took so long, folks? I mean, that's insane that it took that long. And we'll see if we see other polls with similar results. And speaking of the protests and the fact that we still have a pandemic going on, I wanted to mention Robinson Meyer and Alexis Madrigal writing in The Atlantic about a piece that we still have a pandemic happening right now. And it's a really interesting piece. I highly recommend reading that and everything else that they write and post in The Atlantic, but it's titled "America is Giving Up on the Pandemic. Businesses are reopening, protests are erupting nationwide, but the virus isn't done with us." And they write, as the long, hot summer of 2020 begins, the facts suggest that the U.S. is not going to beat the coronavirus. Collectively, we slowly seem to be giving up. It is a bitter and unmistakably American cruelty that the people who might suffer most are also fighting for justice in a way that almost certainly increases their risk of being infected. Well, let's hope the epidemiologists are wrong. Let's hope how we think the virus is passed is wrong, and being outdoors is some type of a game changer, warmer weather, although I think we still don't know the answer to that. Finally, I wanted to mention that Democrats in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, have proposed sweeping new law enforcement reform. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and almost 24 other congressional Democrats took a knee in the Capitol building during a moment of silence on Monday in honor of George Floyd. And then they unveiled a sweeping police reform bill, and you should read about it. It's pretty fascinating to see what activism and what these protests have led to, and that George Floyd and so many others didn't die for nothing. Is that too flippant to say? Is that inaccurate? Do you think that's fair? And one more thing I want to play for you before I get to my first guest, Bruce Bartlett. And that is a young woman who's an activist and an author who, going back to John Oliver, where I started, he ended his show by playing this clip. Her name is Kimberly Jones, and she's a really interesting woman, really smart, passionate, obviously, as you hear. She's an author and won an award from the NAACP. Her book is called I'm Not Dying With You Tonight. And Trevor Noah at The Daily Show and now John Oliver on Last Week Tonight are making her even more famous by playing clips like this on their shows. Here's Kimberly Jones.
Why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
That's our show. Thanks for watching. Good night.
Yeah, John Oliver's smart to end the show on that and not add anything. Me, not so much. I'm still talking. I've got the whole show ahead of me. Oh, was that an amazing rant? And that's just part of it. You should go watch the whole 6 minutes online. Look up Kimberly Jones, who is, well, I'm trying to get her on the show. I reached out to her, but I'm sure she's got about 1,000 requests right now because she's gotten pretty big through her activism and everything that's happened. Okay, so joining me first here on the show today is Bruce Bartlett. Bruce was a regular on the old show. He was a former Republican policy expert who worked for a number of different Republicans in Congress, including Jack Kemp. He is an author of several books as well as articles. He's been published in all of the major media outlets that you've ever heard of. And his most recent book is The Truth Matters, which is so good. I love Bruce. I love the way he communicates. I love the way he talks. I love the way he just doesn't give any Fs at all about anything anymore. He's now a columnist for the New Republic, where he is publishing his most recent work, and I'm very happy to have him back writing. He is on Twitter as well, at Bruce Bartlett. I actually had to create his Twitter account for him like 10 years ago. And now he's got a bigger following than me. And I couldn't be happier about it because he's such a great, smart source of information. And we talked about a number of different issues, from politics to race to even a little bit of history and, of course, economics and the pandemic and what it all means. Love talking to him, and I hope you'll enjoy this most recent conversation with the great Bruce Bartlett. I've got him now, one of your all-time favorites, the great Bruce Bartlett. That's him on Twitter, and he is now writing for the New Republic. He's a proud former Republican, and he's got a new column. You've decided to come out of retirement. I got your email maybe a few weeks ago, say you were looking for a publication, and congratulations to the New Republic for landing the legend. Why did you want to go back to writing?
Well, I'd been away from writing regularly and just doing, the occasional freelance piece. But it gets to be hard to do that because you come up with ideas that it's hard to explain to an editor why it's a good idea. And sometimes you just need to have a column where you can write what you want to write. And that way, it's just much easier.
Great. Well, I'm glad that you're doing it. And I don't know if I missed your first one or if this most recent post is your first one.
Yeah, my first one was last week.
Okay. So we got to talk about that one as well. But let me just start by asking you kind of a shop question, your take on the New York Times getting rid of their editorial page. James Bennett, who led the editorial page. I know him. I've known him for a while. I like James Bennett a lot. He's a great guy. I thought I don't know if he was doing a good job or not, but of course, this is as a result of of the New York Times publishing Senator Tom Cotton's piece about basically sending the military into American streets to put down the protesters. You had a long Twitter thread about this. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what your feelings are on the New York Times editorial page and that piece that they published and James Bennett's resignation.
Well, first of all, people need to understand that the editorial page editor reports directly to the publisher. And so, in essence, he's the publisher's guy. He's there to represent the publisher's opinions and philosophy about what it is that the editorial page is supposed to do. And that includes the commentary section as well. And, so, Bennett's been in this job for 3 or 4 years, and presumably he was doing what the publisher wanted him to do. And now I disagree philosophically with the approach that Bennett took, but I just want to make clear it's the publisher's decision. Okay, I'm not really blaming Bennett, and that philosophy says, okay, we have an obligation to present views that we may feel are abhorrent because we believe that our readers get 100% of all their news and all their commentary from us. So if we don't tell them that there is an idea out there circulating, they simply won't know, which is ridiculous. Of course, the vast majority of New York Times subscribers read many other publications. They certainly can have easy access on the internet to any number of other points of view. So it's silly for the Times to feel, well, we have to present abhorrent ideas because otherwise nobody will know about them. It's simply ridiculous. It's conceited in the extreme. Now, my view is that if the New York Times looks at the landscape of major publications that present commentary, you look at, for example, the Wall Street Journal, a newspaper as big and as powerful as the New York Times. The Wall Street Journal never, ever publishes anything remotely liberal on its editorial page. It publishes hard right-wing, free market, abolish taxation, crack down on the demonstrators. It is the pure Trumpian point of view, especially on economic policy, and doesn't pretend to cover the waterfront. So, and I think that New York Times should view itself as the progressive voice in this country. Of course, there are other progressive voices, But the difference is the New York Times is the biggest and most powerful editorial voice in this country, and for it to force its readers to read crap, right-wing crap, I think is a disservice. I think it's bad business. I think it should try to do a better job of presenting a progressive point of view. And quite frankly, it doesn't do a very good job. Many of its
columnists,
op-ed writers have been there for decades. They haven't had anything to say about anything. When was the last time Maureen Dowd had anything to say about anything that was worth reading?
I don't read
When
Maureen.
did Tom Friedman, have anything worth saying? I think they should clean out the dead wood, bring in a bunch of new people, and do a better job of reaching out to people whose voices are not being heard. So I think they could do a much better job and help the cause at the same time.
What about the idea?
And make more money too.
Potentially, yeah. I'm not sure what the argument against that is, other than, as James Bennett tweeted before he resigned, that the New York Times opinion owes its readers to show them counter arguments. They'd published all kinds of pro-protest columns, particularly those made by people in a position to set policy, i.e. Senator Tom Cotton, who, by the way, he is a scoundrel of the highest order. Do you have any horrible venom to spew at Senator Tom Cotton before we move on?
Well, he's the worst of a bad bunch. I don't know what to tell you, but I mean, think about it from Tom Cotton's point of view. He views, as all conservatives do, the New York Times as essentially being Pravda, just hard left Marxist point of view. Why would someone like him even want to be in the New York Times? The answer is that by being published, it confers respectability. It gives notice, gives currency and legitimacy to the views that he expressed in his column. So the reason why he wants to be published there is precisely the reason why he should not, you see? Now, and now as to the idea that the New York Times has an obligation to present other points of view, there's a very simple way to deal with this that solves this problem, which is you assign reporters to cover what right-wingers are thinking, what right-wingers are saying. Tom Cotton can go onto the Senate floor anytime he feels like it and give a long, detailed speech about, why we should shoot demonstrators on sight or whatever it is he believes, and write stories that accurately represent what their point of view is, fact check those points of view, get alternative points of view from other people, peers and other respected people, and write news stories that will inform people of what is going on among the thinking of right-wing people. That would be the way to handle it. You don't have to hand over a very valuable piece of your editorial landscape to people whose views are, quite frankly, reprehensible.
Yeah. You have long been interested in and even written an entire book about race, a history book of sorts, back in, I think, 2008, titled Wrong on Race, the Democratic Party's Buried Past. And I wonder what you think of this current moment, given the fact that you've took a long kind of scholarly look at the history of race in this country for that book, and you've always been paying attention to the issue. Do you think this is an inflection point, a turning point? What do you think about what's happening now?
Well, I certainly hope so, but it's hard to say. I mean, it's absolutely been amazing to me that we haven't had more of these demonstrations long before now. I mean, it's been a problem for many years that the police are just completely out of control. They go around shooting black men for literally no reason whatsoever. Some guy's holding his cell phone in his hand, and the cop says, "Oh, looks like a gun. I'm going to kill you." And this sort of thing happens with such regularity. I think people become numb to it. And I think black people feel, what's the point of demonstrating? Nothing's going to change. The white power structure wants the police to behave in this way. And we're just going to hunker down like we did, during the centuries of slavery and just, hope and pray for a better day. I don't know what else to say. There have been big demonstrations. There was a huge demonstration right after Trump was elected. All these women, remember, went to Washington.
Yeah, I was there, yeah.
And it had absolutely no impact on anything. And I think one of the reasons why these kinds of demonstrations petered out and had so little impact is because they were never amplified by the megaphone of the media. It really comes back down to problems with the media, that they are not doing their job properly. And you and I have talked about this. They have this attitude that we can't take sides, even when the side is to defend free speech, to defend democracy. They feel like, oh, we have to take a hands-off attitude, and if some guy says, we should kill every newspaper reporter, our job is to say Joe Blow says we should kill every newspaper reporter, and that's that. It's really quite absurd, and it's unprecedented, really. If you go back to previous years, to, for example, the civil rights struggle of the 1960s. The media didn't say, okay, we need to run some pro-segregation editorials, to balance off, our anti-segregation editorials. They didn't take that view. They said anybody who's for segregation is a reprehensible human being whose views are not legitimate, and we're going to, as an institution, throughout all of our reporting, we're going to take the view that segregation is bad and civil rights is good. And that's one reason why that struggle ended positively. Same thing with the Vietnam War. At least up to a certain point, I think that the media was neutral to even supportive. But at some point, they said this war is not winnable. Right. We're just killing people for nothing, and they turned as an institution. The media turned against the war, and so I think there are these cases that show that the media is capable of taking a side and having a great deal of influence on the outcome of these moral struggles, and maybe now they will finally do that. Again, but I think it's been long time in coming.
We could talk about the media a lot more and be more specific and talk about certain outlets and so on. But I do want to ask you about the Democratic Party and their responsibility for change. Forget about the Republican Party when it comes to racism and inequality for a moment, unless you don't want to. But, your first piece at the New Republic for your new column was titled How the Democrats Should Imitate the Republican Party. And I want to get to that. That's more, I think, about electoral politics and running campaigns. But specifically because of your book, Wrong on Race, I feel like the Democratic Party has certainly changed in the last few years, with Obama starting incrementally, of course, his election. And then the midterm elections of 2018 brought in a whole bunch of people of color, women, and with them some what used to be called very radical ideas about race and racial injustice and law enforcement and economics and so on. Do you see a change in the Democratic Party in terms of the policy proposals, much less the rhetoric on the issue of race and equality in America?
Well, certainly we're in the midst of a change, literally, as we speak, that I think is going to have some profound implications. But my general point I've tried to make in my article and in other forums is that I think the Democrats are just not tough enough to do the job that they need to do. See, we can spend all day talking about the problems of the Republican Party, but at the end of the day, the only institution in our society that has the power to defeat the Republicans is the Democratic Party. So to the extent that the Democrats do a poor job of promoting their agenda, promoting their candidates, getting people elected, it hurts all of us, you see. So it's not one of these issues where you can just, stand by the sidelines and say, well, they're going to do whatever they're going to do, and so what? It affects all of us. And I keep trying to give them advice from my years in the Republican Party, working in politics, to try to give them ideas that will help them be more effective to win and get their agenda enacted. Because I think, frankly, they just do a pretty crappy job.
What are some of those ideas that you think they should be implementing?
Okay, well, one of the things that I talked about in my column the other day is that, Democrats still have this old-fashioned view that the way you win national elections is by reaching out to the center, you see, and
swing
trying
voters.
to get swing voters, moderates, centrists, whatever you want to call them, get them to vote for you. But the Republicans don't do that. They don't reach out to moderates. They don't give a rat's ass about them. Their view is we have plenty enough Republican voters to win if we just turn them out. And they put all 100% of their efforts into getting out the vote, turning out the vote, raising turnout among their own voters. And this has been a very successful strategy since 2004, which was the first year they really implemented this strategy. Whereas I think Democrats, like I said, I think they've still got an attitude about reaching out to the center. And one of the problems with that strategy is that it alienates your own party. I mean, if you're, a rank and file Democrat, you're probably pretty liberal, pretty progressive. When you hear your presidential candidate trashing your ideas in order to reach out to some group that isn't even part of your coalition, but might be, it's dispiriting, you see. And so I think that it tends to be counterproductive. I think they need to put more effort into turning out. I mean, it's constantly forgotten in general political discussion, but, Hillary Clinton won a substantial majority of the popular vote.
Yeah.
She didn't lose the election. It's only because we have this idiotic electoral college, which was put in by the Southern slaveholding interests, that and which biases our entire political system in a conservative direction. And it worked perfectly as far as the conservatives are concerned. The one person who won the popular vote lost.
Right.
And so short of doing political reform, which I think we need, and getting rid of the electoral college and things of that sort, you've got to have a policy of turning out your own people, I think.
You write in
That's just one idea.
I'm sure you have many more. You write in this piece at the New Republic, clearly Trump believes that turnout will be the key to his reelection. Toward that end, he supplies Republicans with a steady diet of red meat that often involves lies, conspiracy theories, and mean-spirited attacks on Democrats, the media, and other perceived enemies. Meanwhile, Joe Biden ran as a moderate in the primaries and now must pivot left to shore up the Democratic base. I read one poll this morning here on Monday, the 8th of June, with over 30 or 40 days left before the election, that Joe Biden is up 15 points in a recent poll. And I wonder what you think about Joe Biden's strategy. You mentioned that he's got to pivot. Shouldn't Joe Biden just sit on his hands and not do anything and let Trump crumble? Well,
there's a lot to be said for that. And of course, in effect, that's exactly what he has been doing, because the lockdown has forced him into his bunker or wherever the heck he is up in Delaware, and he's been off the political stage, which ordinarily would be death to a candidate. But as we know, Joe Biden is not the most articulate guy in the world. He makes a lot of gas. Practically every time he opens his mouth, he says something mildly stupid. But he just does. And of course, Trump is having a historically bad time. I mean, he is literally killing tens of thousands of Americans with his ineptness, his incompetence, and his stupidity. It's hard to imagine that the crisis of the coronavirus could have been handled any worse. I mean, really, it could not have been handled worse. And people are dead because of it. And why they are not outraged about it is a complete mystery to me.
I want to argue. I want to think that there could have been something dumber or more inept or passive that he could have done. But the truth is, there isn't anything, because number one, he ignored the problem. Number two, he suggested that people take a drug that was not approved. And number three, he's not listening to the experts throughout the process. So I have to agree with you that if you think of something he could have done that would have been more dangerous or harmful or irresponsible, let me know. But when he told people to take this drug and told people to, take disinfectant, I feel like we were so aghast at those suggestions. You couldn't, even as a comedian or a creative person, come up with something dumber than that. Or maybe not wearing a mask in public and at factories. He did that too.
I know. Did you see, I think it was on Saturday, he went to visit a factory where they're manufacturing the swabs,
in Maine. Yeah.
Yeah, and he refused to wear a mask. Everybody else wore a mask. And because he didn't wear one, he infected the entire facility. They had to throw out and destroy an entire day's production just because he was an asshole. I mean, that's just...
Yeah, I read that.
You can't make this stuff up.
I wonder if they told him that. I wonder if they said, listen, if you don't wear a mask, we're going to have to toss out all of everything we did today.
They probably didn't have the guts. Nobody has the guts to tell the truth to Trump. Everybody's afraid of him.
Those who do, I would push back. Those who do tell the truth, he fires them. Anybody who even pushes back,
true.
He seems to fire them. And that's a real problem, because he's dismissed so many people that were even... you looked at these people as giant assholes to begin with, and then you almost look at them as not heroes, but as somehow noble for pushing back on the president's insanity. People like John Kelly, who, lost.
Yeah, well, but this is also too little too late.
Sure.
And smacks of rats deserting the sinking ship. You get the feeling that a lot of these people like Colin Powell and Jim Mattis, who are, now saying, honest things about Trump, where were they a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? This isn't new, but they're looking at the polls. They're saying this guy's not going to win. It's okay for us to come out and tell the truth because he can't hurt me anymore.
Well, what do you make of?
That's a cowardly point of view.
You have been critical of your former party for years now, and what do you make of these Republicans, like you mentioned, Colin Powell, and now you've got George W. Bush, Mitt Romney, and others saying they're not going to vote for Trump, but shouldn't they go further and say they're going to vote for Biden?
Well, there's still time for them to do that. I guess, everybody needs to stick their little toe into the pool before jumping in. And I'm glad they've done as much as they have. I think that there should be a substantial number of prominent Republicans endorsing Biden by this fall, and I think it can make a difference. I think there are a lot of very cowardly people in this world who will not do something unless they see lots and lots of other people doing the same thing. You say, and it isn't as if every Republican is a moron. They can look at Trump and see that he's a complete idiot. He's doing terrible things, but they're afraid, their friends might criticize them, and they might not get invited to parties, or they'll get into arguments at family get-togethers, and so they keep their mouths shut. But once you build up a threshold of people who on the Republican side who say, yeah, we've got to oppose this guy, we've got to support Biden, I think at the margin it has an effect.
I wanted to ask you, obviously, not only about politics, and we kind of touched on it, but read Bruce's recent piece, second piece at the New Republic, titled, "He is Even Dumber Than We Thought," where you do a good job aggregating both the foreign leaders' criticism of Trump's intelligence and people that have worked in his administration. Anything you want to pick out of that and mention? Because I thought that was a really good short piece, especially about the international leadership and how they see the American president.
Well, look, there's lots and lots of people who every single day on Twitter and other places say Trump's an idiot. And, those because he makes stupid mistakes, typos in his tweets, and, makes factual errors, tells lies, multiple times a day. So I tried to look at this in a little bit more of a scientific or a systematic kind of way. And so I went through a number of public opinion polls that I don't think have gotten any publicity, where they asked the American people, do you think Trump is smart or stupid? And, there's a lot of data showing that a majority of people think he's an idiot. And secondly, I looked at things that have been said publicly by foreign leaders, U.S. ambassadors to the United States from foreign countries such as France and Britain. And, there have been leaks of things that they have written in cables to their home countries where, if you're a foreign diplomat and you're covering another country, you've got to be clear-eyed. There's no benefit to you of lying to your superiors. You need to know the truth. And these guys have said from day one that Trump is an idiot. And there's a number of things I quoted on this point. And finally, I looked at people who have worked directly for Trump, worked in the White House, held cabinet-level positions, Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson, various people who are on the record as having called Trump an idiot. And so I felt that, okay, these are people who know Trump personally, who've seen him in action behind closed doors, people who have, a very strong reason to be clear-eyed and honest in their assessments, and so on. And the all of this put together shows that the guy really is an idiot. I mean, he's incompetent and he's stupid. And the worst thing about it is that he doesn't know it. Because he has money, people have been flattering him his whole life, telling him, making $1 billion is worth a PhD from Harvard, and really stupid stuff that people tell rich people to flatter their egos. And so nobody has ever really told him the truth. He doesn't know. He thinks he's a genius.
Some people would say, Trump supporters especially, if he's so stupid, how did he get elected president of the United States of America? How did he beat every other Republican in the primary?
Well, he had a divided field. What did they have? 13 or 14 or more people running. Each one got, 5 or 6 or 7%, and Trump had like 20%. It wasn't as if he had the support of more than half of Republicans right from the beginning. He was simply he won with a plurality. And it was utterly stupid of the other Republicans not to drop out and to endorse whoever the strongest competitor to Trump was running. They just adamantly refused to do that. They had almost every candidate running in 2016 had a billionaire in their corner, making sure they had plenty of money to keep running long past the point they should have dropped out. It was just really a perfect storm of political stupidity. And you'll notice that the Democrats made a special point of not doing that this year. They made a point of putting enormous pressure on the candidates who could not win to drop out and endorse somebody else, preferably Biden. And it worked.
Yeah, right before the South Carolina primary, you had Pete Buttigieg and others dropping, and then Elizabeth Warren as well.
Because, I mean, Bernie would have had a very good chance of getting the nomination if all those other people had stayed in and divided the vote and prevented Biden or somebody else from getting 50%. So the Democrats learned from the Republicans' mistakes, and I think they're better off for that.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about this an economic question, given the state of the global economy, much less the American economy. You know, you saw the job numbers come out on Friday, and we didn't actually lose as many jobs as we thought. In fact, there was hiring that occurred in April that economists didn't predict, apparently. Almost everybody got that wrong. Not sure what that's all about, but I mean, you see so many different kinds of businesses going out of business, and not to mention industries like the airline industry talking about they won't rebound for decades. How do you see the economy as it is right now, and what do you predict for the next couple of years or a year, Bruce?
Well, I mean, think about some of these businesses that are going bankrupt. A lot of them are things like restaurants, okay? Now, that's too bad for the people who work there and so on. But look, the buildings are still there. All of the kitchen equipment is still sitting there. The chefs have not forgotten how to cook. The waiters have not forgotten how to serve food. It's simply a matter of coming back into business, maybe under a different name, under a different corporate ownership, and they'll just start up again, and we may all be better off for it. There may be a lot of people out there who were thinking about starting a restaurant, and now's the perfect time. They can buy all of the things that they need to run that restaurant very, very cheaply. So I think you have to differentiate between the pain that specific individuals are feeling that may be temporary, and the overall problem of the economy, which I think it may not be as serious as it looks given, the current situation. The main thing I'm concerned about is that people are getting away from proper social distancing and other kinds of things that they should be doing and continuing to do to protect themselves from the virus. And I'm worried that we're going to have a double dip, and that the number of infections and the number of deaths will go back up again. And that could really be a terrible blow to the economy.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm mainly worried about.
I'm glad you mentioned that, and you're not alone. Most of the experts on epidemiology are pretty concerned about that. And almost every historian that knows about 1918 is pretty concerned about it. But I think that's a fair point. Also, with all these protests and people being out there, even if they're wearing masks and socially distancing, it's still really disconcerting. Maybe I want to believe that this is just this kind of sweet spot where the virus isn't as active as it was, and now is the time, if there is a time to be out in the streets and protesting. But I'm not sure that isn't just wishful thinking. So,
well, I'm hopeful, but I'd feel much better if we had vastly more testing. And when I say testing, I don't mean just for people who think they've got the virus. We need to be testing people at random throughout the entire population so that we can get proper data on the incidence of the virus and where it is and what population groups we need to be particularly concerned about and things of that sort. And we're still not anywhere near that. And where we are with a vaccine, I don't know. I hear, same stories you do about, imminent, vaccine availability. But until that we have a vaccine that works and is and lots of people have gotten vaccinated, we're not going to have a herd immunity. And we may not get to it because a lot of moron anti-vaxxers may prevent our ability to ever completely control this situation the way we did in years past with things like smallpox and polio. We destroyed those horrible diseases because we forced people to get vaccinated, and it worked.
Yeah, and you see what has happened with the flu vaccine over the past few years, and that you could have a lot better herd immunity if it was a higher percentage of the public took it. But because of the anti-vax movement, it gives some people, even I want to argue reasonable people, pause on a vaccine like the flu. Oh, that's not going to kill me. Well, we can't get to herd immunity if everybody doesn't take it, regardless of the effectiveness of the flu vaccine over the past couple of years, which we can talk about. But people being so suspicious of these vaccines is
selfish is what they are.
Oh, well, that's a good point. Bruce Bartlett, get his most recent book, The Truth Matters, A Citizen's Guide to Separating Facts from Lies and Stopping Fake News in Its Tracks. Subscribe to The New Republic, where he is now a columnist. And, of course, follow him on Twitter, where he's always active, at Bruce Bartlett. Sir, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
Okay, doke. Thanks.
Okie doke. Thank you, Bruce. Always awesome. Love talking to him. At Bruce Bartlett, please say hello to him and follow him there and let him know that you heard him on the show. It's always very valuable. And I forgot to mention, of course, and I'm sure you're really upset about it, that to plug the paid subscriptions at the top of the show. Don't forget, that's how I'm able to do the show each and every day, daily. 2-3 guest experts joining me in a conversation, and I always want to hear from you as well. We'll do listener shows, trying to do them every week to get your input here and give you a voice. But I can't do it without your paid subscriptions and a bunch of new people signing up over the last couple of days. Thank you to all of the new subscribers. Patreon.com/Pete Dominick, or go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. Okay, time for guest number 2 on today's show. He is always awesome at communicating, always has the information, the arguments, and thought-provoking views at his fingertips. He is Tim Wise. He is an anti-racist speaker and author and educator, and you should check out his website, speakoutnow.org. Speakoutnow.org. Follow him on Twitter at Tim J. Wise, and also he's on Patreon, and you can support him there as well. I've been reading Tim and talking to Tim for years, since my brother actually first turned me on to his work. He was always a favorite on the old show. Some people think he was too divisive, or is too divisive. I just gave out the wrong Twitter handle for him, by the way. Tim Jacob Wise, at Tim Jacob Wise. So some people think he's too abrasive, too divisive. And for some people, maybe he is, but not for me. I think that his passion and truth comes through every time he tells it and writes it. And I love being in conversation with him. And he is one of the most important people you can read. If people want to get educated and understand what whiteness is and white fragility and anti-racism is, and how to check our own biases, and how to grow and learn and continue asking the right questions to fight our own apathy and ignorance, Tim is a great source, especially for white folks. I love talking to him, and here is our latest conversation where we covered a whole lot. Tim Wise, right now. All right, I got the great Tim Wise, and Tim and I have been talking probably for 10 years about issues of racial injustice, and he is one of the best educators in the country. And so, Tim, I hope that your work is getting a lot of attention. And to that point, I wonder if you would suggest any of your which do you think are some of your best books for white people right now? I guess all of them, but White Like Me is I think your most recent book. Is it your most recent book?
Well, no, it's actually the oldest one.
It is? What am I looking at?
Yeah,
I've got it backwards.
There was an update to it, but even that update was in 2011. There have actually been 3 editions that have come out in the last 15 years, but it first came out in 2005.
But I'm seeing all these anti-racist books are like bestsellers, and that brings me a lot of hope and inspiration. And and that's why I asked which one of yours you think would be.
Yeah, no, I think I still think it is relevant because it's personal narrative and storytelling, and I do think sometimes in these moments we can get so deep into the politics of the moment and the ideology of the moment, all of which is really valuable, by the way, but then we lose sight of the personal narratives that actually open us up to hearing let's say, Black truth, because one of the things I've always said in this work is in order for white supremacy really to be eradicated, white folks are going to have to join in true solidarity. And in order to do that, we're going to have to believe what Black people and what folks of color generally tell us about their lives. Well, if in fact we come to believe what people of color are saying, it's not going to be because we took a critical theory class in college. It's not going to be, it's not going to be because we listened to a really cool podcast or a movie. I mean, that might help us. That certainly can open our eyes to some things. But at the end of the day, what that's going to do, that the academic stuff and the intellectual stuff is going to maybe give us some ammunition. But what's going to allow us to internalize that intellectual ammunition is some type of personal experience that opens us up to the reality of Black life. And so the reason I wrote White Like Me as I did when I did, which even though it's, many years old now, still highly relevant, is, in my life, there were a series of experiences going back to childhood that allowed me to see certain things about the way that not only Black life was racialized, but how my life was racialized. And I think if white folks want to be really good, whether we call it allies or collaborators or whatever we call it, we have to all do that. We need to take inventory of our own life experience, because once you do that, you begin to see how prevalent and how important race is, not just in the life of the Black folks who are in the streets right now, but it's also played a huge role in the lives of the white folks that are in the streets right now. And the quicker we understand that, the quicker we can understand our common interest in changing it.
The one question I've been asking a lot of people is people like yourself who have been working in this space of anti-racism, well, in your case, for your entire career, is, you've been screaming these things and writing these things and talking with people like me about these things for years. And I wonder what you think of this time. That's the question I'm asking everybody. What, if anything, is different, and how do we know, and or not?
Well, I think what is different is the background context within which these latest killings, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia by the two vigilantes, Breonna Taylor in Louisville and George Floyd in Minneapolis, the background noise within which those took place. And the background noise of that was COVID-19, right? I think that there are two ways to look at this uprising. One, you could say, and I know some do, well, it's just the straw that broke the camel's back. Cases that finally, this is the one that broke through, and it was on video, and the Derek Chauvin was so nonchalant about the way that he killed George Floyd, and all of that's true. But we've had a lot of these on video before. Eric Garner was killed on video, Tamir Rice was killed on video, albeit grainier, than what this was. So I think that only explains so much. I think what's more likely is that these killings took place at a time when most of us are, sort of at home more often than not. Right. We are able to sort of be quieter than normal. We're not going about our daily bustle in the same way. We're probably online looking at the news more than normal. And so we have the capacity to take it in and to feel it. And the backdrop of COVID-19 also is this example of this country saying in so many ways that Black life doesn't matter, not just on the streets of Minneapolis vis-a-vis, police, but we have an administration pushing to open everything back up as quickly as possible because it'll supposedly help Donald Trump's reelection chances, even though they know from the data that not only will people die, which we all know, but that disproportionately we know who it's going to be. It's going to be disproportionately 40 to 50%, according to the numbers, are going to be folks of color, mostly Black. And you've got all these white folks going to state capitals with their camo and their guns, demanding a reopening of everything, knowing that it's going to disproportionately be Black and brown folks who die. So there's sort of this bullhorn screaming to everyone, including maybe a lot of white folks who never realized it before, just how indifferent or even hostile certain forces are to Black life. And when you have that going on, where you've got tens of thousands of Black folks who have died from COVID who wouldn't have if we had taken it more seriously early on, and then you see George Floyd and you hear about Breonna Taylor and you see Ahmaud Arbery killed, it helps to crystallize in this moment, especially for white folks. And it's not revelatory to Black folks, except insofar as the magnitude of it. But for a lot of white folks who you see going into the streets, I think it's the eye-opening moment that says, oh, so this is what they've been talking about this whole time.
You have several great posts on Medium, and everybody should read Tim there. But I wanted to talk about one, well, all of them, but one titled White Denial, Bad Apple Edition. There's a long history of refusing to see systemic racism. People of color have always seen it. They never needed to read about it, to see videos about it. They lived it. What is the rest of the country's problem? That I mean, a lot of us, certainly on the left, have been talking about systemic racism and recognizing it and calling it out and talking about it and trying to reform it. But that's really been more on the kind of far left. People who are curious, people who really want to understand this injustice, and certainly not mainstream American white folks. Why and what changed?
Well, I mean, let's just first of all understand the magnitude of the denial that I'm talking about.
So
when I say that we deny the problem of systemic racism, I want everyone to be very clear. I'm not just talking about right now. I mean, that article you referenced, I start off by talking about the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, Robert O'Brien, who said the other day, 99.9% of cops are great Americans, and the ones who aren't are a few bad apples that we need to root out. And
since you wrote that, sorry to interrupt you, but since you wrote that, Attorney General Bill Barr has said, I do not, in an interview, I don't think there is systemic racism in policing in America. I'm paraphrasing, but that's
right. And what's interesting is, of course, they've conducted no real survey or research to come to that conclusion. When Robert O'Brien says 99.9%, like, that's a very mathematically precise number. How do you come up with that? Like, I wouldn't venture to give you a number as to how many awful cops there are, because I don't know. All I know is how they act. So I'm not really sure what their attitudes are, but I know we have a militarized police culture that is about dominating and controlling disproportionately Black people. And I know the data says that cops are 3.4 times more likely to kill Black unarmed folks than white unarmed folks. And I know the data says that, in places like New York, stop and frisk was used disproportionately against completely innocent Black and brown folks, where they rarely, if ever, found any contraband or illegal activity. And when they did, they were more likely to find it on white folks, but they kept stopping Black folks more often in spite of that. So that's all I know, is how people act. I'm not really concerned about their attitudes. But when Robert O'Brien says it's bad apples, he is doing what white Americans have always done, which is individualizing the problem of racism, right? Seeing it as an issue of, well, am I a bigot? And we've always done that. We've always looked for the bad individual rather than the system. So as I note in the piece, you can go back all the way to the 1960s. And I make this point all the time, but it's an incredibly important historical point and relevant for today. You can go back to the 60s, at a time when I think most Americans today, even the ones that are pretty conservative and the ones who, would say that racism today is not a big deal. If I were to ask them, hey, 1963, do you think Black folks were getting treated equally then? Well, no one in their right mind is going to say yes, right? That's the height of the movement. It's the year of the March on Washington. It's the year before the Civil Rights Act. It's 2 years before the Voting Rights Act. It's 5 years before the Fair Housing Act. So like every white person is going to agree now that 1963 was sort of a rough time to be Black in America. But in 1963 itself, when that wasn't 50 some odd years in the rearview mirror, but when it was actually happening, 2 out of 3 whites then told Gallup pollsters that basically everything was fine and Black people were treated equally. In 1962, 85 out of 100, or 85% of white folks, said that Black children had the same chance to get a good education as white children. Now, in retrospect, we can look back and go, well, now that's delusional. But that's the point, isn't it? Like, these otherwise reasonable white people who managed to hold down a job, feed the kids, clean out the cat pan, do whatever else they got to do with their daily life, could not understand the reality of the country they lived in spite of the fact that these images of brutality and inequality were being beamed into their house every night on the only 3 networks that existed, which everybody was watching because it was the only game in town, right? They didn't have video games. They didn't have Netflix. They were just sitting around looking at the TV until it went off at midnight and didn't come back on until 6 in the morning. And they still didn't see it. So my point being, if white Americans didn't see it, even when it was, in retrospect, blatantly obvious to everyone, then how much easier must it be to miss it now? And I think that's why when Bill Barr says that, or O'Brien says that, or Donald Trump says that, or white people in your family or your neighborhood say that, it's like, well, if you say there's no systemic racism, A, how do you know that? And B, do you therefore think that the vast majority of Black people who think that it is a problem are simply either unintelligent or too emotional and stupid to know their own lives? Because if you answer yes to that, by definition, you're making a racist argument.
Well, what if it's another third way, the third thing you hear all the time is that they have a victim mentality.
Well, but aside from how arrogant it is to accuse 40 million Black people, or let's say the vast majority of them who find this to be a real problem, to accuse them of having a victim mentality, that also is racist in the sense that in order for that to be true, you would have to believe that the vast majority of Black people are so emotionally fragile, so incapable of determining their own lived experience, so pliable and capable of being manipulated, that all it takes is a handful of crafty, racism talking left wingers to convince them that there's a problem where there really isn't. The reality is victim mentality is not what Black people have. It's what white conservatives have. These are the people who say, among other things, right, that they're the victims of Black Lives Matter, that they're the victims of Al-Qaeda and Muslim terrorism, that they're the victims of high taxation, they're the victims of marriage equality, they're the victims of overregulation, they're the victims of a 30% tax rate, they're the victims of secular humanism, they're the victims of teaching evolution in school, they're the victims of science, they're the everything. They are the biggest snowflakes of all. Yeah. They are the most fragile snowflakes of all. They're the ones who, if you say happy holidays at the Walmart, they lose their mind. If Costco asks them to wear a mask, that to them is tyranny.
Right.
What in the world do these people have? What right do they have to accuse anyone else of having a victim mentality when they think that having to stand 6 feet away from someone else at Trader Joe's means that they're going to be sent to a labor camp?
The great Tim Wise. Yeah, quite a list right there of the examples of victimhood. And I know that you wrote the foreword for and have been doing this work for this book, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Is that her name?
Well, I didn't do the foreword.
I'm sorry, you blurbed it.
But I blurbed it.
Michael Eric Dyson did it for you. You blurbed that. And the point being, she asked you to do that, and it's a great book. But, looking at her work and your work and speaking to that idea, that phrase, white fragility, and you just went down that list. What is the real core work that we need to do to understand our own biases, that we're born into the system and begin believing the system to the point where, as anti-racist as you want to be or whatever, you still have this feeling that somehow you're better than because you're in a system where there's just, frankly, in my opinion, the way I see it, is so much more opportunity and less judgment for white folks and for men, so therefore for white men, than everybody else. What is the work?
Well, I think the work is getting clear on just how misled and how injured even white folks have been by this system. Now, I don't want to make that comparable. I'm not saying we have been damaged by it the way that the targets of it, people of color, have been, obviously. But I think it is important for white folks to realize that when Robin or any of us who do this work talk about white fragility, it's not about trying to make fun or mock them or say, oh, you stupid person. It's actually about saying, hey, this fragility is not healthy. It's not just that it's not healthy for the people that get hurt by it when you act the way you act in political terms, but it isn't really good for you either, right? The actual, the feeling, just the somatic experience that white people have when you bring up the issue of racism, and they get all tense. And if you had a blood pressure cuff on them, you'd see it spike, and the energy that they waste trying to prove that they aren't racist, that's not healthy stuff. That is creating additional stress and anxiety when you wouldn't need to have that if you were actually learning the truth, coming to understand that you are, as you said, part of a larger system, that it's not about saying you're a bad person, that it's not about saying there's good white people and bad white people. In a system of white supremacy, there's just people made white. And what that means, right, is people who are actually given the privilege of being oblivious to the reality that other people experience, and even being oblivious to your own experience and how it's connected to race. I don't see how that can be considered healthy for anybody. So once we begin to get clear on the way that this history has deposited us in 2020 in the middle of this Leviathan, then we can start to realize that it's not good for anyone. It's not good for our children. It's not good for other people's children. It's not good for us. It's not good for them. That yes, there's privilege, there's relative advantage that comes from it, but the cost of accessing that advantage is not only, this sort of metaphysical loss of your humanity, which may or may not appeal to people, but it's also, the reality that if we don't care about inequity, if we don't care about, let's say inequity in healthcare outcomes, then what ends or the fact that, people of color are disproportionately affected by inadequate healthcare, then we don't end up with the healthcare that we need, because we have a society that has sort of racialized the notion of need, racialized the notion of poverty, racialized the notion of people, who need some type of support from the state. Well, that may be true disproportionately because they're disproportionately poor, but that means that white folks who don't have good healthcare also aren't going to get it because we don't want to give it to those people. So then we suffer. Or if you think about, the war on drugs, if you want to be indifferent to the way we fought the war on drugs and you want to be oblivious to the racial nature of that, okay, but wait around 20 years when your communities are being ravaged by an opioid crisis disproportionately, and then come crying to us about how there's no rehab and treatment. Well, of course there's not, because 25 years ago, you opted to elect candidates who thought putting people in jail was the answer to a health crisis. And so, this is the thing. If we would get clear on that, we could become stronger in our resolve to change the system. The fragility is what actually keeps the system in place, because it keeps us from reckoning with the harm that it's done to us.
Yeah. In our lifetimes, we've seen a lot when it comes to criminal justice. You just mentioned it. And, now that Joe Biden is the nominee, or will be officially soon, you look back and go through his record, and he was, quote, tough on crime for a long time. So Democrats and Republicans were tough on crime. Obviously, the Clinton administration passed policies that incarcerated millions of Americans, and we could talk about the war on drugs and so on. But only recently have we started talking about criminal justice reform, and you actually have gotten some serious conservatives on board with that, policy people and in office at the state and local, and even some at the federal level, to the point where they actually passed a very tiny sliver that would make a difference. Of course, it should be mentioned that Obama tried to do that for 8 years, and Republicans wouldn't get on board until the Republican Donald Trump did it with the help of a supermodel or whatever she is, Kim Kardashian, and Kanye West. But, obviously a lot of Democrats have been wanting that for years, but before that, they didn't, is my point. And so when you hear about criminal justice reform and the kinds of policies that need to be reversed and changed, how do you think about what needs to happen, and what we're starting to hear a conversation about, certainly with activists for a long time, but now with leading politicians at the state, local, and national level? What do you hear, and where are we with criminal justice reform? It's not just policing; it starts there.
Yeah, we have to start thinking in terms of completely fundamentally changing not only the systems that we have in place, but even the mentality that undergirds those systems. If you think about, incarceration, we'll talk about two of them, incarceration and law enforcement officers themselves. Incarceration, there are generally a few theories about why you incarcerate people, right? One used to be that you incarcerated people as a way to then offer them opportunities to, be rehabilitated and then released back into the community and become productive, functioning members of the society. That mentality, though it was never done as well as it probably should have, was more or less dispensed with altogether by the 1980s.
Although it's done in other countries.
Yeah, it's done in other countries, but in this country, we moved from that notion to a notion of just punitiveness for the sake of punitiveness.
Right.
Just basically saying, let's just punish them, and it should be harsh, and it should be awful, and we should make them, suffer. And it's just sort of this almost sadistic kind of thing. Now, I would argue that part of the reason that we have a much more sadistic, punishment-focused system, from the streets and policing all the way to imprisonment, is that the criminal justice system in this country developed in tandem with white supremacy. It was all about controlling black people. So you could be vicious and cruel to them precisely because you didn't view them as equally human. Now, the irony is lots of white people will get caught up in that system too. And so you'll always hear people say, well, cops kill more white people than they kill black people. Okay, A, of course, because there's more white people in the country. But B, what kind of rebuttal is that? All that proves to me is that when you allow a system to be developed that's rooted in the notion of dominating black people because they're black, that mentality is not one that the cop is going to be able to switch off when they come into your neighborhood. If they have a militarized mindset that says we're at war with the people, 90% of the time that might affect their mind toward black folks, but that other 10%, it's going to catch your kid, and so yes, there will be residual effects. That's all the more reason to change the system. So we've got to think in terms of depolicing. We've got to think in terms of restorative justice. We've got to think in terms of alternatives to incarceration. Are there going to be some people in any society that has 330 million people that are going to probably have to be separated from the rest of us for their own good and for the good of the community? Of course. Is that a couple million people? Absolutely not. It makes no sense to believe that it would be. So I think we've got to think in terms of public safety, not law enforcement, right? That's a totally different thing. Law enforcement is about domination and control, and public safety is about what's the best way to keep us safe. And I would contend, we could spend a fraction of the money that we spend currently on police departments on things like, gang interrupters and interventionists, which we have in certain large cities around the country. Folks that have been in gangs, maybe some of them have been locked up. Now they do amazing work to try to interrupt gang activity and violence. And if they had a fraction of the funds, they can be effective even now. But imagine if they had millions of dollars at their disposal, led by the community, controlled by the community, to do that kind of intervention.
And by the way,
work.
People should look up Gary Slutkin, who is one of the creators of that method. He's an epidemiologist that was fighting diseases in Africa, came back to the U.S. and treated crime like a disease, and had these interrupters that you talk about, and it's been very effective, called Cure Violence. And I don't know how much it's spread. I just remember interviewing him and talking about that a few years back, and in Chicago, it's been very effective. So
it has been, and people don't realize that because, of course, we only hear about. Chicago's a great example, right? It's always like the poster child that right wingers bring up because they say, "Oh, look at the violence in Chicago." Well, look, there is absolutely too much violence, but the violent crime rate in Chicago is down by over a third, about 40% since the early 1990s. So that doesn't matter to you, obviously, if your child was just shot in a drive-by shooting. I understand that. But the reality is Chicago and every major city in America is considerably safer today than it was 30 years ago. And that's not simply because of aggressive policing. In fact, it's in spite of aggressive policing. We know that some of the communities that had the biggest drops in crime actually moved away from a punitive model of policing during that period. And we're doing things like gang interrupters. We're doing things that were more focused at the community level. We've continued to see in the last couple of years, since 2017, the crime rate in Chicago continued to drop, even though the mayor and the police chief there have moved away from they're still, I would say, far too aggressive, but they're moving in a much different direction than they were previously. So we know that there are alternatives to this, but we are so locked in a mindset that says we have to control people in order to stop crime. And I have to almost think that there's, again, a certain sadistic nature to this, because I've long sort of joked, but I don't think it's really a joke. I think it's true that if I were to say, for instance, that I had, developed a lollipop or a popsicle or something that you could eat, and it would stop crime like it was magic, and it had some kind of formula. All we had to do is pass out popsicles, and there would be no more violent crime. I have no doubt that there would be people on the right in this country that would go, coddling criminal, giving out popsicles. What's the matter with you? These people just need to get their ass kicked, because even though it would work, we're not really interested in being tough on crime. We're interested in being tough on criminals or people who we perceive as criminals. And there's a big difference. If I can prove to you that more compassionate restorative justice methods work and you're still opposed to them, it's because you're a sadist. It's not because you actually want to make communities safe. And I'm not saying that that's the mentality of most cops or most politicians. I'm just saying I think we've all been encouraged to think of crime as this thing that we control with a hammer and a steel-toed boot
right.
and a jail cell, instead of dealing with the problem on the front end. And we're the only Western industrialized nation that seems to think that's the way to go. And yet every year we continue to have a problem with crime. And so what do? We keep throwing money to the same people. You know, if you had schools that failed to educate as much, or if you had a business that failed to sell their products as much as police fail to actually, you know, make the community safer, we wouldn't be giving them hundreds of millions of dollars more each year. We wouldn't, you know, we just wouldn't do that. We would figure out an alternative.
You know, I was talking to this police officer who is a former member of the CIA, counterterrorism expert named Patrick Skinner last week, and he was in Afghanistan, he was in Iraq, he understood the strategies the military took in both countries. And anybody that knows what insurgency is and counterinsurgency is, COIN as its acronym is called, understands why it failed, frankly, in those countries and why it wasn't effective. And he basically compares policing in America to the strategies that the American military occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan took in these counterinsurgencies. He says the police, obviously right down to the fatigues, the way that they train, they see the community as their enemies, not as he refers to them as their neighbors. They're not trying to win hearts and minds, of course. And you know, I wonder what you think about that mentality that police have, unfortunately, of kind of fighting an insurgency, dehumanizing the people that they are policing, much less having relationships and calling them neighbor, as Skinner does.
Well, I think that mentality, which has probably always existed to some extent within law enforcement, but it's certainly gotten worse in the last 30 years or so, where we've seen the intense militarization of law enforcement, from the equipment that they use, you know, actually being able to get decommissioned tanks from the Department of Defense and various armed services, wearing camo. Like, why do you need camo in Ferguson, Missouri? Like, what are you trying to blend in with? Like, where is the sand dune on fluorescent? Like, there isn't.
That is a really important point. I wonder if anybody's heckled these cops that are faced like, do you know how much of a silly goose you look wearing desert camo in
I know,
the
it's
middle
like, I see you, I can see you. Like this is not working.
What
are
you doing? And it looks like a shitty Halloween costume. It's they should be embarrassed.
The only reason you do it is for this mindset. And there was a piece I was reading the other day. You know, someone was talking about an implicit bias training that they had attended, or maybe they had facilitated it, but they were in the room. It was in Minneapolis. You know, that's a police department that's done all of these trainings, and it clearly hasn't worked, right? And so this person who wrote the piece was talking about a cop who was in the room who's cussing up a blue streak, talking about, I don't want to do this. It's a waste of my effing time, blah, 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 going off. And finally, you know, he says, you know, it's like they asked him, I guess, why do you think it's a waste of your time? He goes, because I got to maintain my warrior mentality.
Yes.
It's why I became a cop.
Right.
And it's like, wait a minute.
That's
what?
the wrong reason to become a, yes. No.
Yes, it's exactly the wrong reason. And, you know, I've heard some people say lately, you know, if you want to become an officer, you ought to have to undergo the kind of training. Ibram Kendi said this the other day in an interview that we were both in, that, you know, his wife, I guess, is a doctor,
physician,
a practicing physician. Yeah. And he said, you know, she had to go through all this training, all of this school before they let her into a position where she could screw up and take your life. You know, but to be a cop where you're definitely in the same position, and unlike the doctor, you have the license to kill and probably get away with it most of the time. They don't have nearly the same training. And you know, so I think, number one, to the extent that we're trying to de-police, there's still going to be a transition period, and we certainly should require considerably higher standards. We ought to require people who are going to become police to take the same kind of lie detection examinations that you would have to take to become an FBI agent or a CIA agent, to really find out about where your head is before you get into that. We've got to move away from militarization. And I think we've got to do something else. You know, I've been saying this for years, at least since Ferguson, and it's stuff the Malcolm X grassroots movement and other people of color-led orgs have been talking about for a long time. And that is, if we're going to have police on our streets, the communities of color who were so over-policed and damaged by them ought to have the right to decide who's going to police in their communities. And we could do that by saying that if you're going to be an officer in a community of color, you've got to spend the first, 4 months, 6 months, whatever, basically without a gun, without a badge, without the power of arrest. You're on the payroll, so you've got the uniform, you're a cop, you're getting paid, but your job for 4 to 6 months of a probationary period is you're going to go into the communities where you might be asked to police. and you're going to knock on doors, meet people on the porch, go into the barbershops, go into the coffee shops, the bodegas, the mosques, the churches, talk to people on the corner, and really you'd be functioning almost like a community organizer for 4 to 6 months, because you'd be listening. You'd be talking, yes, but you'd be listening, asking questions, finding out what people need. And then at the end of the probationary period, having had a chance to get to know people in the community and they know you better, they would get to vote on you. And only the people in that community would get to vote. And if they, feel after 4 months that you're a pretty good person and you probably got the right attitude, they'll give you the thumbs up. If they think you got a, warrior mentality, they'll give you the thumbs down. But that would be a certain degree of self-determination where the community would get to pick who's going to be walking around with the ability to arrest or even to kill people in that space.
That's a really interesting idea. I wonder if it's been applied anywhere in America, in police departments, which are so deregulated and fragmented from each other. That's another big issue with police departments and law enforcement in America is that there is a different set of rules for seemingly every town and state.
Right.
I saw today, Tim, that the Democrats in Congress have proposed a bill to reform specifically policing. I don't know if you've seen it. It just came out. It's interesting what they have listed in there. From a quick glance, it doesn't seem like a lot of what's in there. I mean, it's a step forward, but it doesn't seem like a lot of what the activists have been asking for aren't necessarily there. But
right. I mean, banning chokeholds. Look, communities that have technically banned chokeholds are still having people die from really what are chokeholds. You remember with Eric Garner, they argued, well, that wasn't really a chokehold.
Exactly.
Because they said
there's ways around it.
Right. It's like they said, well, the chokehold would cut off your windpipe, and that really just cut off his carotid artery. So that's different. Well, okay, whatever. Like, at the end of the day, how is that really different? So you can ban certain procedures. You can have certain use of force requirements. You can do body cams. You can do all these trainings. You can do all this stuff, but that's not fundamentally challenging the culture of policing. It is not encouraging people to put the public safety above their sort of brotherhood and sisterhood of blue. And we know from the evidence, I'm sure you may have talked to a couple of these guys, but there were 2 officers several years back when all the Freddie Gray stuff went down in Baltimore. And when he died in police custody, 2 guys white guys who'd been cops with the Baltimore PD, Michael Wood Jr. and I can't remember the other guy.
Joe Crystal.
Joe Crystal, yeah.
And I know that because I read your piece, but I did interview Michael Wood a couple times, and I just heard about Joe Crystal after reading your piece in Medium.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right. So these are guys who went into it for all the right reasons. I think Joe Crystal came from like 2 generations of cops or something.
Yeah.
Right? They both wanted to be cops their whole lives. They'd been in the military, I think. I know Wood had been. And so they had the right intentions. But as soon as they saw corruption and brutality and planting of evidence and beating the hell out of suspects, and, they said something. And I think Joe Crystal actually asked his mom and dad, who had both been law enforcement officers, like, what do I do? And they're like, you know what you got to do. You got to report it, right? Well, he does. And they both get run out of policing because they're violating the code, right? So what does this reform bill do about that? Absolutely nothing. What does this reform bill do about these trainings that I read about, a couple of years ago? I haven't seen anything about it in the recent uprisings, but I'll try to find the link and send it to you. But there was a training that cops were having a couple of years ago. This guy was going around training police all around the country with this warrior mentality mindset stuff. And one of the things
I saw in the documentary Do Not Resist by Craig Atkinson, which is about the militarization of police. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but he features a guy like that or that guy who is training police, and it's the scariest shit I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of documentaries because
and what's the scariest line in there is where the guy basically tells them, after you kill somebody, go home and have sex with your wife. It'll be the best sex you ever had.
I don't recall that, but that's that made me nauseous.
Things, the guy I'm talking about, that's one of the things he tells them. He tells them that you get such a rush out of killing someone that it will actually improve your sex life. Like, what kind of crazy shit? Like if you've got police departments who are bringing somebody like that in, the whole department's got to go. Like, the whole department, just clean it out. There's no way that those people can protect and serve the public. So this reform bill, I mean, yes, that's great. It's sort of like the First Steps Act or whatever that Trump signed. Okay, fine. But at the end of the day, we've got to move toward fundamentally different models of public safety. And is that going to involve a certain number of people who have the power of arrest? Well, of course. I mean, we don't expect that, every problem is going to be handled by a mutual support organization or by community organizers or by mental health experts. But do we need the number of cops that we have? Do we need the kinds of budgets that we have? Do we need the kinds of equipment that we have? No. Do we need to be, do we need to be saying, hey, in order to be one of those smaller number of officers that we're going to keep, we're going to expect you to get a college degree. We're going to, and we'll help pay for that if that's what you want. Just like if you want to go into the military, we'll help pay for that. But, we're going to expect you to have this kind of background. We do know from the research that officers who have college degrees actually have lower numbers of complaints and lower incidents of brutality. So that actually does matter. And yet instead of encouraging that, and I was talking to a buddy the other day, and he was talking about a friend of his whose brother had gone to not only gotten an undergrad degree, but went to a law school, a really good law school, got a law degree, understands things like, the Constitution. And this guy wanted to be a cop, and he wanted to be a cop for all the right reasons. And he had a hell of a time finding a job as an officer, even though he scored as high as you could on all the necessary tests. He was absolutely qualified. He had very high, rankings from his training. He'd gotten a law degree, and these departments were like, no, we don't want that guy. Right. It was like, why? Because they couldn't understand why he wanted to be a cop. And it's like, why would you want to be a police officer? Well, what do you mean? Right. Like, wow. I don't know, because I understand the law and I'd like to uphold it. Yeah, we don't want that. Because, they're thinking in their mind, if that guy's out there with his partner and his partner's beating the crap out of somebody, he's going to be the guy that's like, hey, wait a minute, you need to read him his rights. Right. It's like they don't want that. And so it took him. I mean, he ended up getting a job in a department, but there were a bunch of other departments that didn't want him. And the ones who particularly didn't want him were the ones that had the higher crime rates and where the work would have been perhaps more difficult. He ended up getting a job in like a relatively placid community where they were like, oh, okay, you know about the Fourth Amendment. Well, that's okay.
All right. Last question for you, Tim, which is about parenting, white fragility and parenting. Some people really don't want their kids knowing the truth about racism in America. Your most recent post at Medium, which everybody has to read, this is where you also talk about how some comments that you made were taken out of context, and Tucker Carlson or Cucker Tarlson. I hate being a hacky guy making fun of names, but I did like that one. Right. And Alex Jones apparently got hold of them, and you and your wife have been getting phone calls. You talk about this horribleness in this piece, but to the point of parenting, I think it's such an important thing for you to be teaching us about.
Yeah, I mean, the point I tried to make in that piece and the point that I tried to make in the CNN clip, which led to all the misunderstanding and hate mails and deliberate bad faith on the part of certain right-wing folks is just that, look, if Black parents have to have these conversations with their children, and they do, they don't have the luxury of not talking about racism, because it literally puts their children at risk. And I'm not just talking about from police. I mean, just generally in life, you have to talk about not only the history of racism with your kids if you're Black, but also the reality of stereotypes today and biases today. So if Black parents have to do that, who in the hell are we as white parents to think that we shouldn't have to do that we should somehow be able to leave our children in this bubble of naivete and untrammeled, innocence and this sort of nice little, unbothered world? I'm sorry, if other kids have to deal with real stuff, then our kids have to deal with real stuff. And that's not about trying to make them feel guilty, and it's not about trying to make them feel ashamed. In fact, I think what it's about is saying, you know what? I think that, number one, people deserve the truth just as a general policy. But number two, I think it's about getting kids involved and thinking about how to make the world a better place. There was a rally here in Nashville, 10,000 strong the other day, one of the biggest rallies that we've ever had in this town for anything. And it was organized by 6 young women between the ages of 14 and 16. And 5 of them were young women of color. 1 was a young white woman. Now, if those young women are, kept innocent and naive by their parents, including the young white woman, then they're not going to be organizing that rally. Right. And so I think that young people need to know the truth, because young people have got a lot to teach us. And I think that young people have an innate sense of justice, which is, as I argue in the piece, maybe one of the reasons that some white parents get so bent out of shape at the idea that we ought to teach them about injustice, because deep down they know that if you get to a kid at 10 or 11 or 12 and talk to them about the way the world really is, not the lie that we've sold our children, but the actual reality, they might actually say, enough of that. I want to be part of changing that. And if you're really bought into the system the way it is, you don't want your children to be part of changing it. You sort of like the way it's going right now. And so I think that's all the more reason we need to have these conversations as parents, all the more reason we need to have these conversations in schools. And I'm sure there are going to be some folks who are going to melt down at the idea, who think they have the right to teach their kids whatever they want. And they do, I guess. You have the right to teach your children whatever you want to teach them. The problem is your children are going to come out into the larger society and deal with the rest of us. And as a result of that, the society has the right to put some expectations on them
Very well
about
said.
the things that they're going to learn. And if they got to learn geometry, they got to learn about this,
Yeah, and they shouldn't call the police on black people when they're in the park. Like, somebody's got to teach people that. I mean, that and the history of that, and so that doesn't keep happening. Speakoutnow.org, and a lot of people have been reaching out to me to ask me who are the best types of guests to join them, not on their media outlets, but at their corporate meetings, Tim, which I think is really important, because people are now wanting to learn more, and we're seeing a lot of change. And you've always been someone who would speak obviously on campus, and I mean that's been your thing for years. Obviously, where no one's going anywhere for a while, probably. You're offering some different programming, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity here, because there's a lot of people that have reached out to me. What are you offering companies, corporations, campuses, and organizations in terms of training? And how can they get a hold of you? Or, I mean, obviously speakoutnow.org, and anybody can contact me and I'll hook you up with Tim. But what are you offering this summer?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just myself, but Speak Out, which is the organization, the nonprofit activist really collective that I've been part of for 25, 26 years now, has a whole range of folks, mostly people of color, but also some of us who are white and do this work, who, have been doing work, like you said, on campuses and in communities for a very long time. A lot of us have been at it for 20 to 30 years, but there are also some amazing young folks, emerging voices who are doing incredible work, and they can also do, webinars and conferences, or once we get back to normal, come to folks one-on-one and do trainings and real, larger events. I personally, have a couple of different webinars that I'm doing right now for institutions, both educational institutions as well as potentially corporate or organizations, nonprofit groups, community groups, or whatnot. So if folks want more information about those, both the webinar type component of it, or even the in-person stuff for, perhaps several months from now, you can reach out to speakoutnow.org, or you can email them at info@speakoutnow.org. And, we can try to, hook you up and make something happen, hopefully in the next, several months.
Tim, thank you. As always, appreciate you joining me. It's always a pleasure. I always learn so much. Thanks a lot, pal.
Oh, you bet. Thank you.
There he is, Tim Wise. So happy to have him on the show, and I hope that you'll go buy all of his books. Tell him you heard him on the show as well, at Tim Jacob Wise on Twitter. Hire him for your HR workshops. He can do virtual workshops. Just a lot of people have been reaching out to me, asking me who to read or who maybe they can bring into their companies to talk to their coworkers. And Tim is really an excellent educator. I highly recommend him. All right, so first two guests of today's show are two of your all-time favorites and regulars, people who I love talking to as events unfold in our world and in our lives, Bruce Bartlett and Tim Wise. But I always want to introduce you and myself to new voices, and that's who our next guest is, a new voice, at least on the show. He is a prominent businessman and investor who made a lot of money as an initial investor of that company Blue Apron. He also co-founded and helps run Aspiration, which is a really interesting online financial institution that has moral values to it with over 2 million customers. He's got a recent piece in Business Insider that lays out the need for a $25 minimum wage, and he joined me to give his expert analysis on why and how that can be done. In the midst of the pandemic, we are calling on nursing assistants and orderlies and all kinds of people, we're calling them heroes, but too often they aren't making enough money to even make ends meet. Their median hour wage is $14.25. And so Joe is calling for a major increase in that median wage for these folks who we're calling essential workers and healthcare heroes, et cetera. Joe Sanberg joins me right now. You can follow him on Twitter as well. I also want to apologize for some minor technical difficulties. You know, sometimes when you're talking to somebody on Zoom and it kind of slows them down and sounds like they're slurring, like they're drunk. That happens a couple times to Joe's side of the conversation. I apologize for it. I should do better, and I've had a backup, and I promise you I will in the future. I hate when there's technical and quality problems like that. So sorry about that. Happens a couple times, but I think it's fun when it happens. It's kind of like, is he slurring his words? No, that's just the software and the connection. All right, here it is. Joe Sanberg right now on Stand Up. All right, I got him now. Joe Sanberg is joining me, and I'm very happy to have you here, sir. I was reading about your life and your work and your voice. A lot of people are listening to you and your morality, frankly, on things. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Basically, you're a guy who's done really well. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, how you've gotten to where you've gotten, but you are calling for there to be a lot more value given to folks in a certain class of workers that have been exploited for a generation or more. And I wonder how far back you want to go in America's economic history to talk about where it began, because it wasn't always this way.
Well, there's been ebbs and flows over the course of our history, and you can go back through the course of human history, and there's always been a tension between those who have and those who need. But now we're at a really low point relative to what those who need have. You go back to 1960, and had you grown the minimum wage at productivity until today, it would be $22.50. Now, I think growing the minimum wage at the rate of productivity is fair-minded. I'd add that CEO pay grew many multiples faster than the rate of productivity since 1960. So you bring it forward to the present, and instead of the minimum wage being $22.50, it's $7.25. And I've been proposing that we need to pay a $25 minimum wage. And I'm stunned by the response of some small number of people who think this is some radical idea. All I'm suggesting is that we put the minimum wage at about the place it would have been if workers had been growing their share of income in our nation at the same rate as everyone else. Instead, the last 50, 60 years has crushed workers.
Do you think there's, outside of the wage stagnation, are there any other policies, fiscal or monetary policies, especially I think tax policy, much less you could talk about trade and automation, that you point to that have created the wealth disparity outside of this obvious one, wage stagnation?
Well, tax policy has a lot to do with it, and you're right to note that. Let's take, for example, where we create incentives. We load up the tax code with incentives for companies to invest in capital equipment, but we don't load up the tax code with incentives for companies to invest in people. And I've always believed that tax policy is a reflection of your societal priorities. And if you look at the federal tax code, it's a pretty pathetic reflection of our piss poor priorities. It tells us that our priorities are about profit maximization and machines instead of human beings.
Yeah, but I mean, are you a critic of capitalism? Because it seems like you are a capitalist and have done well, but you also are criticizing all these other policies. But isn't that what capitalism calls for?
No. And I think we get lost in a lot of these labels, but I would unpack
I agree with that
particular point, which is, Adam Smith, who was the initial capitalist, if you will. He said that monopoly right now is where huge corporations pay lobbyists to write special rules so that they have advantage. That's not any form of free market capitalism as Adam Smith imagined it. This is oligarchy. This is corporatism. I
feel like I think that's true, and it's unregulated. But so let's go back though to the issue of wages. $25 minimum wage. I mean, you're asking I guess, government, local or state government, much less the federal government, to enforce this, right? I mean, it wouldn't be voluntary. That's what a minimum wage is. Frankly, I think there should be a maximum wage, but we could talk about that later.
Damn right we're asking government to enforce it. And a lot of times people who criticize the minimum wage say, well, a certain group of businesses can't afford it. What about the certain group of businesses that absolutely can afford it? What about the humongous monopolies that make billions of dollars of profit every year, who obviously can afford to pay their workers a minimum wage? And we can make concessions to ensure that a minimum wage doesn't crush small businesses. It's absolutely true that giant corporations face a different burden in fulfilling the $25 minimum wage than small businesses do. But instead of just shutting the issue down, let's acknowledge that a huge set of monopolies can absolutely afford to pay a minimum wage. Let's make them pay a minimum wage of $25. And then let's figure out how to provide supports and incentives so that small businesses are able to compete.
Right. Because I was talking to a friend who owns a smoothie shop, and she said she would never, she's a very progressive woman, a black woman where most of her employees are minorities. And she said she would never vote for Bernie Sanders because he was going to make her have to pay $15 an hour. And I can't argue with folks like that, Joe, because I've never met a payroll. So I don't know what it's like to run a small business, much less a large company, and have to meet payroll. You're saying carve out exceptions for someone like that with a small business with a few employees?
What's happened is we've set minimum wage policies for the smallest businesses instead of setting them for giant monopolies. And yeah, I'm empathetic with the small business person who would face a hard time paying a $25 minimum wage. And I think we should create exemptions in the tax code so that a $25 minimum wage wouldn't crush small businesses. But on the other hand, can anyone argue that pick any number of your giant monopoly corporations that they couldn't pay a $25 minimum wage?
Right. I mean, I certainly can't. I'd love to try to make our conversation more interesting, but I can't come up with anything right now.
So what happens?
Off the top of my head.
People who oppose a $25 minimum wage go right to the argument that, well, small businesses can't afford it. Instead of going to the solution of, let's acknowledge tens of millions of workers work for companies that absolutely could afford a $25 minimum wage. Let's make those companies pay $25. Right. And then let's thoughtfully figure out how to create exemptions and incentives for small businesses so that they can compete.
You've been on the front lines out there in California doing everything you can to help folks in healthcare get the PPE they need. And you're doing a lot of work just, on economics. You're worried about the homelessness issue, which is a serious issue in California. It's going to get a lot worse all around the country. I think that's fair to say. So how has the pandemic, what has it laid bare here on wage inequity, and how are you saying that the pandemic is, now is the time to call for $25 minimum wage?
Well, the pandemic has laid bare what anyone who'd been paying attention knew, which is we have an economy of a small number of haves and everyone else on the outside looking in as have-nots. And our priorities are all wrong. The people that are earning the least are actually, in times of crisis, the people we need the most. This is a moment to totally restructure the economy, and it's a fork in the road that's going to either exaggerate these inequalities or repair. What I'm deeply concerned about is we're going down a path that's going to exaggerate them. So they're not being accessed by small business who are women or people of color. The people who most need the stimulus funds are not receiving them. Furthermore, I think we've made a colossal error in how we've tried to protect employment. So we've gone down this course of sending everyone a lot more unemployment insurance, which in isolation is good. Of course, we need to get money to people. But what we should be doing instead is what Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal has proposed. And that's just guaranteeing 90% of companies' payroll costs so that employees aren't fired in the first place. What we've done now is, yes, give people who are fired a lot of push, but the businesses, and so when it does come to work, if instead we focused on let's keep everyone employed, then we'd have a much faster recovery. what we're doing now is going to exaggerate the concentration of economic power in the hands of a tiny number of companies.
How many people have you employed throughout your life at different periods of your life?
Thousands, maybe in the tens of thousands indirectly through, investment management funds where I've bought companies and, they've employed a lot of people. And I can tell you that the number one thing as an employer you worry about is the demand by your customers for your products. This is the biggest thing that the political class misunderstands. And if you give workers more money, then you have more demand for your goods and services. And people who argue against this need to argue against the ghost of Henry Ford, who obviously is a capitalist and said himself he wanted his workers to make enough so they could buy his products and cars. And the biggest problem that I'd find entrepreneurs cite before the pandemic was that people didn't have money to buy their goods and services. And the surest way to get people more money is to ensure people are making a living wage. So this idea that like a minimum wage is somehow going to hurt business, a minimum wage that's a living wage, is actually totally backwards.
Yeah, I mean, it drives me nuts when people argue that taxes are the much bigger issue over what you just stated, really articulately, demand. But and Joe, I'm not good at economics, much less arguing it, but I do want to know what you think of every time I hear the Henry Ford example, that he wanted to pay his employees enough to buy the product that they were building and to create more demand. I don't think you can argue with that. But I think that because of globalization, markets have changed. So you don't care what you're paying your employees. You're paying them just enough to keep them there. And that what the local market demands for employment, you don't care if they can buy anything because your product, because you're selling it all over the world. How is globalization and the increase of capitalism and opportunity and just wealth around the world change that dynamic with paying your own employees? Because I feel like if you could sell it anywhere, who gives a shit about your own people?
One of the ways we can make a minimum wage that's $25 even more effective for the economy is by implementing it in parallel with another pro-business approach, which is Medicare for all. Now, at the surface, people don't associate Medicare for all as pro-business and pro-economy, but it would be one of the most stimulative things we can do for the economy. And here's why. Employers are not intending to be in the business of healthcare administration. And as businesses are competing globally, they're competing with other developed economies where there's single-payer health insurance. The United States is the only country in the developed world that doesn't have single-payer health insurance. So as a consequence, our companies are carrying the burden of health insurance costs, where companies in other countries are operating in an environment where their governments are paying for health insurance. So to businesses who say, well, how am I going to pay for a $25 minimum wage? My answer is, when we have Medicare for all, you're not going to be paying for health insurance. And so you can redirect those monies to pay for a living wage.
What would you say to a CEO, specifically the former CEO of SiriusXM where I worked, who said, when I made this argument to him, I was just making this political economic argument about why do you want to pay for our health insurance? Why wouldn't you want the government to cover it? And his argument was, and I've heard a lot of people say this, we offer attractive benefits to attract talent like you, and we beat out the competition with a better healthcare plan or a healthcare plan at all, because some people don't. What do you make of that argument? Because I still think that the point that you made makes a lot more sense, and there's a lot of examples of it in the real world. Like I think GM moved a factory to Canada because they have single payer, and why wouldn't you just move it from Detroit to Windsor or whatever they did? But what do you make of we can attract better talent with better healthcare benefits? I don't think
we should be rewarding talent with better healthcare. Healthcare is not something that should be distributed based on your talent. Healthcare is something you get because you're a human being. And this is an example of this fetish of meritocracy we have in the United States. Now, I think it's totally great and fine that if you come up with a great idea or you're more skillful at something, that maybe you have a nicer car, maybe you have a nicer house. But whether you're a genius at something should not mean you get better healthcare. I don't care, in fact, even how hard you work. That shouldn't determine whether you get good healthcare. You should get healthcare because you're a fucking human being. And this is one of the most broken elements of our culture. And what's sick about it is it's only broken among a teeny number of tycoons in New York City and politicians in Washington, D.C. This idea that healthcare is about a human right is obvious to most Americans, but it's been politicized and corporatized by a small number of DC and New York. And it makes me so angry, and it should make everyone else angry too.
I sometimes change that the language a little bit and say health insurance should be the right. Everybody should be covered and not fear that if they get sick or injured, they're going to lose everything. Because I mean, I don't know if I'm splitting hairs or not, but I think that. By the way, it's not just most Americans, obviously. The whole rest of the world looks at our stupid healthcare system and can't imagine why anybody would ever allow for it.
Well, let's get straight to part of the heart of the matter. Racism.
Go ahead.
Racism is a major factor as to why the United States still doesn't have single-payer health insurance. The advocacy for single-payer health insurance is not new. President Truman advocated for single-payer health insurance. In fact, if you go into the history books, you'll find he was close to getting it. And what stymied him? Racist senators from the South who didn't want to desegregate hospitals. So we cannot deny the racist history and racist undertows to the opposition to single-payer health insurance.
How do you think that plays out in today's America? The idea of racism
all kinds of subtle ways. Politicians don't feel moved to fight for single payer because the biggest beneficiaries are Black and brown people. And they don't feel like, they don't feel a sense of accountability to non-white voters. All kinds of subtle things exactly like that. The structure, frankly, of our electoral system where certain geographies where senators might have more, at least subtle racist views, if not explicit racist views, have disproportionate power. Let me pose it to you this way.
Go ahead.
Do you think if there was a plan to provide single-payer health insurance only to white people, that Trump Republicans would support that plan?
Yeah, I can see him selling it right now. I mean, without even being shy.
Because here's the rub. In every other developed country that has single-payer health insurance, that also means that in those countries, their conservative parties also support single-payer health insurance. So the weird thing about America isn't just that we don't have single-payer, it's that our conservative party is the only conservative party in the developed world that doesn't support single-payer.
Right. Well, because
what's unique about our conservative party in America versus the conservative parties in Britain and France and Germany and Japan and Australia? It's the, at least subtle, if not explicit racism.
Well, I mean, you think you could say that there's a lot of racism within the conservative parties throughout Europe.
But you're right. What I should have attached to that, though, is our society is heterogeneous.
Right. That's a good point. But the other thing is, it's just a weird thing. Like, even if, I like to make the racist argument for certain public policies. Like, okay, you hate Black people, fine. But if everybody's in the pool, it's going to cost less for all of us. Like, everybody wins when these are the arguments, by the way, that you're, I think, making, at least how I'm hearing. Everybody's going to win if you pay people more. Nobody's losing something. We're always pitted against each other. Like, if you make more, I'm going to lose something, but it's not the case.
No, it's not. And you don't need anything more than second grade math to understand that.
Yeah, fair enough. What about your how did you arrive at these opinions? I mean, I'm reading your biography. I don't know you, and so I'm prepping and reading stuff about you, but you went to Harvard and then you went to Wall Street and you made a bunch of money and you made obviously some pretty smart investments. I mean, it looks like you did really well as an initial investor in a company that everybody knows now, Blue Apron, and founded your own firm. I mean, tell me a little bit about how you came to your wealth and why someone with your wealth would be so anti-poverty.
Well, first of all, I grew up poor. My mom raised me by herself. And she infused in me and my brother a deep conviction about justice. My mom's the number one reason why I feel so strongly about helping others and fighting for justice. We lost our home to foreclosure when I was a teenager. And I always felt like our family was on the outside looking in, just like tens of millions of other families feel the same. So that never leaves you the way you grew up like that.
Right.
And, I worked my way through Harvard. I was fortunate to get a ton of financial aid. I started my career on Wall Street, but I've spent most of my career trying to build companies that fix things. The biggest example is aspiration.com, which is trying to upend the banking industry by delivering banking accounts that match your values and your money. One of the things we're not doing enough for social change is utilizing the power of our wallets. Every day we spend $36 billion as consumers, but we do very little to make sure we spend that money in ways that are aligned with our values. So what Aspiration's done, over 1.5 million customers now, is made it easy for you to make spending choices at places that treat their workers and the environment better. So I've been trying to build businesses like that are using the free market system to deliver essential services. You have to have a banking account. Well, what if you can get a banking account that doesn't charge you the onerous fees and does right by people and planet? We're proving that those things actually are more successful than doing it the old way. And I'm hoping that other people are going to catch on and, build their own businesses like aspiration.com.
Well,
but it all goes back to my mom fundamentally.
Yeah, that's a great answer in the way that you talk about how it never leaves you. I mean, how poor were you?
Well, I'd say we were working poor. And I think this speaks to one of the problems with how we discuss poverty in America. We didn't go without food, but we weren't middle class. Yet we call almost everyone middle class in this country. 10 people are living paycheck to paycheck. Our family was definitely without food, but we've left the rhetoric in this country to describe those who are poor as only those who are the most extremely poor, and then everyone else describes themselves as middle class. If you're waking up in the middle of the night wondering how you're going to pay for your kids' doctor bills, that's not middle class, even if you're earning above the so-called poverty line. Right? If you have no financial security and one problem in your house is going to send you into financial ruin, that's not middle class, even though you might be earning an amount above the so-called poverty line.
Right.
And so one of the reasons why, I really talk about my experience growing up being poor, even though my mom didn't earn an income that was below the so-called federal poverty line, is that so-called federal poverty line has relegated the discussion of poverty and what crisis we have to paycheck. That's not middle class. That's poor. And if we all start understanding that what unites us is this common experience of financial insecurity, then maybe sooner or later we'll start governing this nation to tackle our number one economic problem, and that is this humongous crisis of poverty.
Well, it's great to have someone like you with your success and your experience and credibility on the issue of fighting poverty. I've long talked to policy experts, and I think there's a lot of people, by the way, in government that are wanting to do the right thing, and so it's great to get you. Put you on that list that I've been aggregating for years of anti-poverty heroes, because I think that you are one of them, and you've done a lot with your wealth, with your success, with your voice. So I'm so happy to make your acquaintance, Joe, and to have you here on the show for the first time. And I look forward to talking to you more. And if there's anything else I can do to boost this campaign for $25 or anything, is there a final call to action that you might say for listeners?
Well, stay tuned. We're just building momentum. And if you want to follow what comes next, please follow me at Joseph N. Sanberg on Twitter.
There you go. Follow him right now, Joseph N. Sanberg on Twitter. I hope you get thousands of new followers from your appearance today. That would be amazing, folks. Give him a follow, and that'll guarantee he comes back and keeps preaching this anti-poverty ideology, which is really important. Joe, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
All right. What do you think? $25 minimum wage? Is it feasible? Is it possible? Can it happen? Medicare for all? These are the types of policies that we need to reduce poverty in America. At Joseph N. Sanberg. Follow him there. That's it for today's show. 3 great guests: Bruce Bartlett, Tim Wise, and Joe Sanberg. And who else should I be having on? You let me know. I'm getting great suggestions from listeners each and every day. The show has been really blowing up. I'm very excited about what's happening with it right now as well. I've clearly been enjoying myself and found my groove and figured out how to do this in the most efficient way every day, and I'm loving it. I am loving doing it. So thank you very much to all of you who are supporting with a paid subscription. If you aren't, Please consider a $5 at least as the minimum paid subscription for this show, which I'm putting out each and every day. All these guests that you can hear on the major cable news networks, but for 2 minutes, 3 minutes apiece, joining me for long-form, thoughtful conversations. Let me know who you want me to have on. I'll do my best to get them on, and I hope that you'll come on and tell your story at some point as well. Thank you for listening. I'll talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up. Oh, and I didn't forget, you're not alone. I am here with you, right here with you. I love you. I'll talk to you soon.